In this video, I'm going to show you how to build a single 90-degree crossing using our diamond line crossing kit. This one I have in my hand is a code 83 version, but today I'm going to build a code 100 version. The steps to building a code 70 or code 83 are virtually identical to building a code 100, so the instructions will apply to all three rail sizes. This video will not focus on building a double or a dual crossing or a quad crossing. These are a little bit more involved, and I'm going to cover that in more detail in a separate video. So let's begin. There's 4 steps to assembling a diamond line crossing kit. The first step is to clean up the crossings, or clean up the castings that are included in the kit. Second step is to solder the rail into the castings. A third is to assemble the crossing, and fourth is to do the final cleanup. Included in the kit are the castings, the rail, which is pre-cut to length for you, and it's also pre-cleaned. We wash this in an ultrasonic cleaner to remove all the dirt and oil and grease that's left on the rail from its manufacturing. It makes a big difference when you're putting something together if the rail has been cleaned. There's a set of small sanding blocks, some coarse 320 grit and some 600 grit, and we use this at the very end to polish the top of the finished crossing. And of course PC board ties and the laser cut matching ties for the crossing that we're building. I'm going to pop open this package of castings. It's important that when you do this, that you do it over top of a table or a bench. You don't want one of these to pop off and get lost. As we all know, when something shoots off, it goes into another dimension, never to be found again. So we supply them on these laser cut bases, and we've already done the first step of cleaning up these castings, and that's what these bases are for. We press the raw casting into this base, and we sand the length of the end of these rails to a precise location. We figured we'd do that step for you. That way you know that these are going to be correct. And we use some specialized equipment to do that not everybody has. The castings themselves are in a raw state, so they need to be cleaned and polished before anything else can be done to them. You can tell looking at the casting, they have a bit of a dull and a bit of a coarse surface texture to them. That's just how they look after they've been cast. There's a really easy way to clean these up using a wire brush. And this works so effectively, we've included this in all the kits. And to go from this rough surface to a polished casting is just a matter of giving it a few strokes with this wire brush. You want to do the top of the rails down into the flangeways, all the edges. You want to give it a nice good polishing. Now when you look at that, after just a few swipes with that wire brush, you can see how nice and shiny that is. We want to do that because this will keep this in a nice clean state long after you build it. The surface texture and patina of the raw casting needs to be removed. It's almost like a cancer. If you leave it, after a while, it'll get worse and worse and worse. But once you've polished the castings, they will stay nice and shiny. So that's the first step. So these bases do a really good job of holding everything steady while you give that a really good aggressive polish. You can see these are nice and shiny, and they're ready to go on to the next step, which is to pop them off of this base, and then we're going to prep them for soldering. 3 and 4. We no longer need this. This can be discarded. Now the same thing is true with the bottom of these castings. You can see they have that same patina, and we have to get these nice and clean before we solder. The pieces of rail that we include in the kit are designed to slide into the grooves in the end of the casting like that. And we need to solder it in place, and we solder it in place from the bottom. If you do not polish this surface, it will not solder. It's plain and simple. Unless that surface is clean and shiny, forget it. There's no way you can solder it. So this step is very important, and you cannot skip it. The best way we've found to do this is to use one of these wire brushes and a rotary tool. The one that I'm using here is it's the kind that hang up on the wall, and you can run it with a foot pedal, which is nice because it keeps your hands free. But you can put these wire wheels in any moto tool and get the same results. We want to polish down in this groove, anywhere we're going to be doing any soldering, and this is the area we are going to be doing the soldering, is in this groove and then on the end. So that's the part I'm going to polish. So that's one done there. I've polished both sides where the rail is going to be soldered in, and I did a very light polishing on the top as well, because you want the solder to sweat down in there. And I'm going to do that to all 4 of the castings. Okay, with all the castings polished, the next step is we have to do some prep on the rail. We supply the rail cut to length, but where the rail has been cut can be a little bit rough and might have a burr on it. So we need to clean that up in order to ensure that it's going to slide into the castings properly. And we found that the best way to prepare this rail is to file or sand a bevel on the end of it. It makes putting it into the casting much easier. You can do it like this with a hand file. It takes a few strokes on each one. Or if you got a belt sander, benchtop belt sander, or disc sander handy, that can make really short work of this. Okay, that's been done on the rail. You can see I've got a nice long taper on the end. The next step, which is very important to do, is to remove any of these burrs on the rail. And then we're going to go back to the wire brush for that. It does a couple of things. One, it'll remove the burrs, and it'll clean and polish the rail and get it ready for soldering. Okay, we've done all the prep work on the castings. Got them polished, cleaned, and ready to go, and we have our rail shaped and polished and ready to go. So the next step is we're going to solder it all together. Working with castings is a little bit different than working with traditional rail and PC board ties. The process of soldering requires that everything is very clean and done just the right way. If it's not, you will not get you'll not get good results. Once the parts are cleaned up and ready to start soldering, we're going to be handling them. And the most important thing you can do at this stage, believe it or not, is wash your hands. You don't want any of that oil that gets on, that forms on your skin, to get on the castings prior to soldering. It makes it very hard for the solder to flow correctly, and it'll cause the surface to tarnish where you've touched it. So you want to keep your hands very clean during this step. Once the crossing is finished and cleaned and painted and installed, that's not nearly as much of an issue. But during construction, it is. So before I carry on, I'm actually going to go and get any of the grease and dirt that's on my hands cleaned right off. This is the way we wash our hands, wash our hands, wash our hands. Okay, with everything cleaned up, including us, the next step is to proceed to soldering the rail into the castings. Before I continue, I want to talk a little bit about soldering a casting. This is a bit different than soldering rail to PC board ties. We usually recommend using these small pencil type tips for soldering rail to PC board ties in our assembly fixtures. The small tip allows you to get in there into a tight spot and get the solder to flow around nicely. But when working with castings, you need a little different approach. What we need when soldering castings isn't so much more heat or more power. What we need is more heat transfer. We want to get as much heat off of this tip and into that casting as possible. If you're using a smaller tip like this, it takes a lot longer to get that heat to transfer. This larger tip will allow that heat to transfer at a significantly higher rate. This is just a regular 35-watt Weller iron. We found that this works just fine as long as everything's been prepped properly and you use the proper flux and the proper solder. Now with that said, let's solder one together. The most important first step is to test fit that the rail is going to fit nicely into the casting. We've taken a lot of effort to ensure that there's good interchangeability between the rail and the casting, but casting is really a bit of a black art. Sometimes the castings come out slightly smaller, slightly bigger. Sometimes the rail can be a little stiff, sometimes a little loose. Even the rail itself can vary in size. But for the most part, I think you'll find that they'll slide in there fairly easily. We want to slide this tapered end in to the pocket like that. One thing I thought I would point out is if you look at the casting and you can see that this rail, this gap in here is tapered, which means that this little part on the side is bent over a little. That's easily fixed, and we want to fix that before proceeding because this is what holds the rail in place. Sometimes these do get bent in the cleaning process or even in the casting process. So we just take a set of rail cutters and just gently squeeze it together like that. So it's parallel or even a little bit tight. That way it's going to hold on the rail nicely. Once that's done, and now we can slide the rail in there. Now that sits in there nice and parallel and holds the rail in place. Now underneath, you can see we've kind of formed a bit of a pocket here. And that's not by accident. We actually want that little pocket because that's where we're going to put the solder. So we're going to grab a little bit of our paste flux, and not much, and we're just going to paint on the bottom of the casting, the bottom of the rail, and a little bit in the pocket. You don't want to put too much on because there's just that much more you got to take off after. You just want enough for it to do its job, which is to clean the casting as we're soldering. So we're just going to lay that down flat, grab our iron, and do the same routine we recommend for fixture built turnouts. A little bit of solder onto the tip, tin it, dip it into the flux. That will help clean the tip nice, and then use a wire brush, give it a rub down, and then we'll have a nice shiny tip ready to solder. Now this is going to transfer heat very nicely because that tip is nice and clean, our parts are nice and clean, our hands are nice and clean. Now we're going to apply the heat onto both the rail and the casting, and we're going to let it sit there for a few seconds. We really want that heat to transfer. And I could see that the flux immediately melted. And then we're going to touch the solder to the tip, push it in, and it's going to flow into the casting just like that. That's it. Not much to it. We're going to do the other one, same way. Get the heat onto the casting and the rail. Give it a good 5 or 10 seconds. Feed the solder into the tip, and I'm just dragging it around. The longer I leave that heat on there, the more it's going to melt and flow down into the cavities between the rail and the casting. And let that freeze. And this freezing step takes longer than you might think. You want to let it sit for several seconds before you move it, otherwise you'll break your solder joint. So there it is. Those two pieces are soldered in there nice and solid. You can see the little bit of solder has wicked out on the edges. That's how we know we got a really good flow. This is not coming out of there. That is solid as can be. Very nice, nothing to it. Next step is we want to file this smooth so there's no bumps or anything protruding up that's going to cause it to not sit flat onto the laser cut ties. And we do that just with a small flat file here, and just quick pass to make it nice and flat. All right, now the last step in the soldering process, and this is very important, as I've been stressing all along, is we want to clean this up. You can see how nice and shiny this is and dull that is. With a little bit of the acid flux on there, this will cause this to slowly tarnish over time. So we want to get that nice and clean. And again, back to our trusty wire brush. This will work magic. We want to hold it nice and solid so we don't break any of our solder joints, and give it a really good aggressive scrub. See, it's already changing colors. There, you see we get that nice brushed nickel look, which would make sense because this is exactly what we're doing, is we're brushing nickel. Nice and shiny. And I'm going to give it a once over on the top as well, get any discoloration off of it. Beautiful. Look at how nice that looks. Sweet. Nice and solid. So that's the first one done. This ultimately will be sitting here on our laser cut ties when we're finished. So we're going to do that 4 more times, once for each corner. Okay, our soldering's complete. Parts are all nice and clean, and we're ready to install them on the laser cut ties. So before adding any glue to glue them in place, we want to do a test fit. And they just simply press into the pockets like so. And you want to use these lines, there's guidelines on the ties to make sure that the rail is centered on the ties. Sometimes you need to give it a little bit of an adjustment, bend a little bit to the left or to the right to make sure that they're running right down the middle of the ties where they belong. Squeeze in the next one. This one needs a little bit of a tweak there. Now you can see that there's a gap between the 2 castings, and that's there for a very important reason. That's our electrical isolation gap. Without them, we'd get a dead short. This is what I was referring to at the beginning of the video when they were in here and we were filing them to length. What we were filing is the size of this gap. And we want to get it to a fairly consistent size. You don't want it too big or too small. You want to make sure there's enough of a gap in there that these 2 castings are not going to touch, because if they do touch, you'll get a short. This is a good amount of space there. So those 2 in, we'll put in the next one. Press it down. They should just be, a little bit of a squeeze with your thumb to get them in place. This one here could use a little tweak there. That one looks good. Gap looks good, and we'll get the 4th and final one in. Oops. Until they're glued in, they can be a little loose. And that one in, and lost that one. Back there, there. That looks good. So we're happy with that. See how easy that is to get that together? Doesn't that look great? So now we're going to solder in the VC board ties in these pockets. These pockets will hold the tie in place while we're soldering it, and it's going to lock all the pieces of our crossing together into a single unit. We supply them on a fret like this, and they just simply clip off with a set of rail nippers. You just cut right in to the edge of the tie here. Snip all 4 off. So this is just a piece of scrap. Now the next step is very important. We want to file the tie smooth. So a little bit of a burr from where I cut it there. But most importantly, we want the top and bottom of the tie very smooth and shiny. A couple passes on a big file like this, and you can see how nice and shiny that is. That's going to take solder very nicely. If you don't do this, it won't solder. Simple as that, and you're going to have a bad time. So now we're just going to set the tie down and then set the track over top of it like that and solder it in place. This is where we grab our trusty trifecta track gauge. This is going to hold everything in gauge while we solder it in place. Oh, sorry, that's the code 71. I want the code 100 one. Bear with me here. There we go. Code 100. Put the pin in. Hook the lugs onto the top of the rail. Lock it in place. Now we know we're in perfect gauge. And I'm going to solder this one on first and then the second one. Same process as before. Very small amount of flux, both sides of the rail. Cleaner tip. I'm holding the trifecta in place with my finger while I'm soldering. Let that freeze. Come around, solder the other side. So I bent a little hook on the solder so I can get it where I want it. That looks like it's a bit of a blob on there, but when we clean this up at the end with a wire brush, that completely disappears. So now we solder the other side. I'll turn the gauge around. Sure it's hooked on there, so we're engaged. A little bit on this side. And you see the solder float off to the other side. Hold the gauge down, remove the heat, let it sit for 5-10 seconds so it freezes. Remove the gauge. Now we're perfectly soldered and engaged in place. And we're going to repeat that 3 more times. Okay, the PC board ties are soldered in place, so the next step is to glue everything down to the ties. First thing we're going to do is slowly, carefully remove this from the ties. You just pop it out, like so. Now this will stay together as a single unit, and we just set this aside. And we want to cut these pockets off. We don't need them anymore. They're easily removed with a quick snip of the rail nippers. Alright, and we don't, these can be discarded, we don't need them anymore. Now we have our set of ties. So we're gonna grab some trusty plyo bond. See, this thing's been around since the beginning of time. We're gonna add a bead of plyo bond everywhere there's a web between the ties, anywhere where these lines, and all in here. And then we're gonna add a bead to the bottom of all the rails up to the PC board tie, not past it. So I'll do that now. Give it a good shake. Now we use plyo bond. We recommend plyo bond. We've been working with it for almost 20 years. We can't say enough about it when it comes to working with track. It's a contact type of adhesive. So you put it on both surfaces. You let the liquid evaporate for a while, 30 seconds. And then when the two pieces touch together, they bond very tight. You apply some pressure and the bond will start to cure. It comes to a full cure after about 24 hours. But just applying pressure on it briefly is usually enough to get a nice good bond. It'll actually increase in strength over time. So as the trackwork sits, it just gets more and more solid. We highly recommend you don't use anything like Walther's Goo, because that is a rubber type cement that will never cure. It doesn't do a very good job of evaporating, and it tends to be visible after it's been applied. Some people say they like to use cyanoacrylate adhesives. They're far too brittle for this. The bond will crack over time and the track will come off. This is by far the best adhesive to use for this job. So now that we've got a bead on both surfaces, on the wood ties and on the rail, we want to let that sit until that liquid in there evaporates. One thing that plyo bond does tend to do that's a little bit irritating is it's a little stringy. I don't know if it'll show up on camera, but I can see we've got some strings between the rails, and I like to pull those off with a pair of tweezers before getting everything in place, because it will show up after you paint the finished track. You'll see those strings. Okay, so I'm just gonna let that sit for a moment while it cures. Okay, that's dried up and ready ready to go. You can see there's no more liquid left, so we're just going to press the two pieces together. And it doesn't really matter which way it came out, it'll go in the same regardless of the alignment here. And we use the holes in the bottom of the castings to get everything in the right spot. Like that. Press it down. Like so. And it's not really necessary to heat this like we do when we build turnouts in the assembly fixtures. Because there's so much surface area here, it's going to have a pretty good bond right off the bat. And if you want, you can clamp this and let it sit clamped for an hour or two, and that will make sure everything stays nice and flat. I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to move on to the next step. But I would recommend clamping it and letting it sit for an hour or two. That way the castings are pressed down nice and flat into the ties, and the top of all the rails will stay nice and flat. But the final step is to do a bit of a cleanup on the finished piece. It may be necessary, but not likely, to clean up a little bit in the flange base. Sometimes there can be little bumps in here, but I'm not seeing any in these castings. It's kind of rare. These feather edge files, a nice sharp edge, do a great job of that, getting down in and making sure there's no burrs anywhere in all the flange bays. We'll do a quick test with a set of wheels to see how it rolls, but I can tell you right now it's going to roll very nicely. They always do. They come out perfectly engaged every time. Very nice. Lots of clickety-clackety, that's normal because we're going through a lot of gaps and bumps, but that's nothing wrong with that. Now, if you'd like, the next step, we can polish the top of the rails. Sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's not. These castings look pretty good. You could almost leave it just the way it is. If they're nice like this, a quick polish with a Bright Boy, like so, does a really good job of bringing up the shine and making sure everything's going to run through it smoothly. But I'm going to go to the steps of using the sanding discs that we provide to get a really good, nice, flat surface. We find that on the doubles and the quads, this becomes more of a requirement, but on the singles, not so much. But you want to start with the coarse sandpaper block, and I like to sand on a 45 across the top like this. And what I'm watching for as I'm doing this is high spots and low spots. Castings don't come out perfectly flat. They come out pretty good, but sometimes there can be little bits of high spots and low spots, and that'll show up once you start sanding. You can see a little bit of a low spot here, a little bit there. So I'm just going to polish this for a little bit until I get a nice flat, even plane all the way across the whole thing. What that does, it just improves operation. That way when things roll across it, nothing's moving up and down and bouncing around. So I'm going to turn this 45 or 90 degrees and go the other way, and that way you can really see if there's high spots and low spots. There's a little bit one in there. Now, the difference between a high spot and a low spot can be just a few thousandths of an inch, so you don't want to get too wrapped up in getting it all perfectly flat, but this little bit helps. And a little detail that I like to make sure shows up are these little gaps right here. What they are, and it's on the prototype as well, is where the rail is slid into the casting, and there's always a little bit of a gap there. Sometimes you get a bit of solder in there. You can see that right here. And I like to pop that out with the edge of a blade, because when you do paint the finished track work, you see those gaps, and it's a nice little detail. So I like to make sure that they're all nice and clean. So I'm pretty happy with the first pass. We give you a couple of these because they don't last very long. They plug up pretty fast. I don't give a quick pass with the second one. It's still nice and sharp. And then I'm going to move on to the polishing one, which is the 600 grit. Again, I like to turn it 90 degrees so I can see. You can see the surface changes The shine on the surface changes quite a bit. And I'm going to get right in and get a nice polish right down into all the spots. But now we're getting a nice flat surface on the top of the castings, the rail, the whole thing. So everything's on an even plane. So stuff rides through, it's going to ride through nice and smoothly. Okay, now the final step is to give it a shot with a bright boy. These are about 1500 grit, so it's really smooth. And it does a good job of taking out the last of the scratches that might be in there. Again, I like to give it a final pass and a bit of an angle. There, that's looking really nice and shiny. Nice and flat. And you can see we got lots of dirt in here left over from the sanding step. I'll get rid of that. And we'll give it a final pass with our trusty wire brush. This works really well at smoothing out these solder joints as well. This is all it takes to knock the high spots off the solder joints. It makes them virtually invisible when the track is finished and painted. You can't see it. There we go. Nice, good looking crossing. Everything looks lined up. Bolt detail looks really cool. Very nice. This will give you lots of good service on your layout. And the last thing I would do at this point is give it a coat of paint. This one's got a shot of, I think it's just some camouflage flat paint. I got it at the hardware store out of a rattle can. You want to paint it while the paint is still wet. Use the back of these blocks and wipe the paint off the top of the rails. Let it dry and then clean it up with the white boy afterwards. And that way nothing is going to corrode or tarnish on you. It'll stay nice and shiny until you install it on the layout. There we go.